Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands with an old rag as she closed the hood of Mrs. Peterson's sedan. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small auto repair shop where she had worked for the past 3 years. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, and her dark hair stuck to her forehead despite being tied back in a ponytail. She glanced at the clock on the workshop wall and sighed. It was already past 6, and she still had 2 more cars to finish before she could go home. The shop owner, Mr. Frank, had left hours ago, leaving Sarah to handle the evening workload alone. This had become a routine she was all too familiar with. Ever since her husband Miguel had been laid off from the construction company 6 months ago, Sarah had been working double shifts to keep their family afloat. Their 8-year-old daughter Emma needed new school supplies, and the rent was due in just 5 days. As Sarah bent down to collect her tools, she heard the distinctive rumble of a classic muscle car pulling into the parking lot. She looked up through the garage door to see a pristine 1967 Ford Mustang fastback in candy apple red. The car was absolutely gorgeous, but something was clearly wrong with the engine. Black smoke poured from under the hood, and the engine made terrible knocking sounds before finally dying completely. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in his early 50s wearing an expensive navy suit and Italian leather shoes. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and even from a distance, Sarah could tell his watch probably cost more than she made in 6 months. He looked completely out of place in her modest neighborhood auto shop, and she wondered why someone driving such an expensive classic car had ended up at Frank's garage instead of some high-end restoration shop. The man approached the garage with obvious frustration written across his face. He pulled out his phone and appeared to be making several calls, his voice growing more agitated with each conversation. Sarah could hear fragments of his discussions about important meetings and urgent deadlines. Finally, he hung up and walked directly toward her. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his tone polite but stressed. "I'm having some serious engine trouble. I have an extremely important business meeting across town in 2 hours, and this car just died on me. Is there any mechanic available who might be able to help?" Sarah looked at the man's expensive attire and then at her own grease-stained uniform. She was exhausted from the long day, but something in his eyes told her this wasn't just about inconvenience. There was genuine worry there, the kind that came from having everything riding on one crucial moment. "The owner left for the day," Sarah replied, wiping her hands again. "But I can take a look at it if you'd like. I've been working on cars since I was 16, learned everything from my father before he passed away." The man's eyebrows raised slightly, and she could see him hesitating. She was used to this reaction. Many customers, especially wealthy ones, weren't comfortable having a woman work on their expensive vehicles. They would often request to wait for a male mechanic, even if it meant longer delays. "Look, I understand if you'd prefer to wait for someone else," Sarah continued, trying to keep any defensiveness out of her voice. "But honestly, I know these classic Mustangs pretty well. My dad restored a 65 when I was growing up, and I've worked on several similar models. Plus, it's getting late, and most other shops in the area are already closed." The man looked back at his smoking Mustang, then at his expensive watch. He seemed to be weighing his options carefully. Time was clearly running short, and his choices were becoming limited. "You know what?" he said finally, extending his hand toward her. "I'm David Reynolds, and right now you're my best hope of making it to the most important meeting of my career. If you're willing to try, I'd be incredibly grateful." Sarah shook his hand, noticing the firm grip and the genuine desperation in his voice. "Sarah Martinez," she replied. "Let me grab my diagnostic tools and see what we're dealing with. No promises, but I'll do everything I can to get you back on the road." As they walked toward the Mustang together, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what kind of meeting could be so important to a man who clearly had wealth and success. The stress lines around his eyes suggested this was about more than just business. Whatever was riding on this evening, it was something that meant everything to him. Sarah popped the hood of the Mustang and immediately knew they were dealing with a serious problem. The engine bay was filled with steam and the acrid smell of burning oil. She grabbed her flashlight and began examining the engine components methodically, her trained eyes searching for the source of the trouble. "When did you first notice the problems?" she asked, running her hands along the engine block to check for unusual heat patterns. David loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, watching her work with obvious anxiety. "About 20 minutes ago. I was driving perfectly fine, then suddenly there was this loud banging noise followed by all that smoke. The engine just completely seized up." Sarah nodded as she continued her inspection. She checked the oil dipstick and frowned at what she found. The oil was completely black and had the consistency of thick sludge. Moving to the radiator, she discovered the coolant was also contaminated and running dangerously low. "Mr. Reynolds, I need to ask you something. And please don't take this the wrong way," Sarah said, straightening up to face him. "When was the last time you had this car serviced?" "The oil looks like it hasn't been changed in months, maybe longer." David's face flushed slightly with embarrassment. "Honestly, I inherited this car from my father about a year ago. I've been so busy with work that I never really thought about maintenance. I just assumed it was fine since it was running okay." Sarah tried to hide her surprise. Someone wealthy enough to wear a suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary had neglected basic car maintenance on what was clearly a valuable classic vehicle. She realized this man might be successful in business, but he knew absolutely nothing about cars. "Well, the good news is that the engine isn't completely destroyed," she said, pulling out her tools. "The bad news is this is going to take some time. You've got a seized oil pump. Your coolant system is completely clogged and several gaskets have blown. In normal circumstances, this would be at least a 2-day job." David's face went pale. 2 days? I can't wait 2 days. This meeting tonight, it's not just important, it's everything. My entire company is on the line. Sarah could see the genuine desperation in his eyes now. Whatever was happening in his life, this wasn't just about being late to a regular business meeting. She made a decision that went against every practical instinct she had. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," she said, rolling up her own sleeves. "I'm going to attempt something that's either going to get you to your meeting or completely ruin this engine forever. But given the situation, it might be worth the risk." She began pulling parts from her tool cabinet with practiced efficiency. "I can do an emergency flush of the entire system, replace the oil pump with a temporary fix, and bypass some of the damaged components. It won't be pretty, and it definitely won't be permanent, but it might get you through tonight." David watched in amazement as Sarah began disassembling parts of his engine with the confidence of someone who had been doing this work for decades. Her movements were precise and sure, and she worked with an intensity that reminded him of his own dedication to important projects. "Why are you willing to do this?" he asked as she carefully removed the oil pump. "You said yourself this could destroy the engine completely." Sarah paused for a moment, a wrench in her hand. "Because I know what it's like when everything depends on one moment. When you've worked for something so long and so hard that you can't afford to let one obstacle stop you." As she worked, David found himself really looking at Sarah for the first time. Her movements were economical and professional, but he also noticed other details. Her wedding ring was simple and worn, clearly not expensive. Her work clothes were clean but had been mended in several places. Her hands bore the calluses and small scars that came from years of manual labor. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, genuinely curious now. 3 years at this shop, but I've been around cars my whole life," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. "My father owned a small garage when I was growing up. He taught me everything he knew before he died when I was 21. I worked at a dealership for a while after that, but when my daughter was born, I needed something closer to home with more flexible hours." David noticed how her voice changed when she mentioned her daughter. There was a warmth there, but also worry. He began to realize that this woman working on his car was fighting her own battles, dealing with her own pressures and responsibilities. "This is going to work," Sarah said with determination as she installed the temporary oil pump. "It has to work." For the next hour and a half, Sarah worked with an intensity that David had rarely seen in anyone. She flushed the entire cooling system twice, replaced 3 blown gaskets with temporary seals, and performed what she called an emergency oil change that involved completely cleaning out the contaminated oil system. Her clothes became even more stained with grease and coolant, but she never slowed down. David found himself rolling up his sleeves and helping where he could. He held flashlights, handed her tools, and followed her instructions without question. Despite his expensive suit getting dirty, he seemed completely focused on helping Sarah succeed. "Pass me that socket wrench, the 3/4-inch one," Sarah said from deep under the hood. David looked at the array of tools and had to ask which one she meant. As she patiently explained the difference between various tools, he realized how much skill and knowledge went into this work that he had always taken for granted. "You know, I've never actually watched someone work on a car before," he admitted as Sarah tightened the last bolt on the cooling system. "I just always dropped it off somewhere and picked it up when it was done." Sarah emerged from under the hood, wiping sweat from her forehead. Most people are like that. They see cars as just machines that should work without any attention. But every car has its own personality, its own quirks. You have to listen to what it's telling you. As if to prove her point, she turned the key in the ignition. The Mustang coughed and sputtered for a moment before roaring to life with a deep, healthy rumble. The black smoke was gone, and the engine sounded strong and smooth. David's face lit up with relief and amazement. "You did it. You actually did it." Sarah smiled for the first time all day, but she held up a cautioning hand. "This is just a temporary fix, remember? You need to get this car to a proper restoration shop within the next few days for permanent repairs, and you absolutely have to stay on top of regular maintenance from now on." David was checking his watch and gathering his things when he realized he had no idea what he owed for the repair. "What do I owe you for this?" "Honestly, name your price. You've saved my entire business tonight." Sarah calculated quickly in her head the parts she had used, plus the labor for what was essentially an emergency repair job. $75 should cover it, she said. David stared at her in disbelief. $75? Are you serious? I was expecting hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 for emergency work like this. It's just temporary repairs with basic parts. Sarah shrugged. I'm not going to overcharge you just because you're in a bind. David pulled out his wallet and handed her a $100 bill. Keep the change. And honestly, that's still not nearly enough for what you've done for me tonight. As he was about to leave, David paused and really looked at Sarah again. She was cleaning up her tools, putting everything back in its proper place despite her obvious exhaustion. There was something about her work ethic and integrity that impressed him deeply. Can I ask you something personal? He said. You mentioned your daughter earlier. How old is she? Sarah's face softened immediately. Emma is 8. She's the reason I work so hard. Her father, my husband Miguel, lost his job a few months ago, so I've been pulling extra shifts to make ends meet. David nodded thoughtfully. What does your husband do? Construction work, mostly residential projects. He's a good worker, very reliable, but the company he worked for lost several big contracts and had to let a lot of people go. He's been looking for work every day, but things are tough right now. As David climbed into his restored Mustang, he couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah had told him. Here was a woman working double shifts in a garage, using her skills to help others while struggling to support her family. She had worked a miracle on his car and charged him practically nothing for it. Sarah, he called out as he started the engine. Thank you again. You have no idea how important this was. Sarah waved as he drove away, then returned to cleaning up the shop. She had no idea that David Reynolds was the CEO of one of the largest construction companies in the state, or that the meeting he was rushing to would determine whether his company landed the biggest contract in its history. As the taillights of the Mustang disappeared into the evening traffic, Sarah finished putting away her tools and locked up the shop. She was exhausted, but she felt good about the work she had done. Helping someone when they really needed it always made the long days feel worthwhile. She climbed into her own car, a 12-year-old Honda with over 200,000 miles on it, and headed home to her family. Emma would probably be asleep by now, but Miguel would be waiting up, probably working on job applications at the kitchen table. Tomorrow would bring another long day of work, but tonight she had made a difference for someone who truly needed help. David made it to his meeting with just minutes to spare. The temporary repairs Sarah had performed held perfectly, and the Mustang purred like a contented cat throughout the entire drive across town. The meeting was with the City Planning Committee for a massive downtown redevelopment project worth over $50 million. His company, Reynolds Construction, had been competing against two much larger firms for this contract. The presentation went flawlessly. David's passion and energy, fueled by gratitude for making it there at all, seemed to convince the committee that his company was the right choice for the project. When they announced that Reynolds Construction had won the bid, David felt a surge of relief and triumph that he hadn't experienced in years. As he drove home later that night, David couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Martinez. The more he reflected on their encounter, the more impressed he became with her skill, integrity, and work ethic. She had saved his entire business without even knowing it, and she had done it with such grace and professionalism. The next morning, David called his assistant and asked her to research construction workers in the area who might be looking for work. When she asked what specific qualifications he was looking for, David described Miguel Martinez based on the little information Sarah had shared. It didn't take long for his assistant to find Miguel's resume and employment history. Meanwhile, Sarah arrived at work to find Mr. Frank in an unusually good mood. "You did some kind of miracle work last night," he said with a grin. "That guy with the Mustang called this morning asking specifically for you. Says he wants to schedule regular maintenance and he's recommending our shop to all his friends." Sarah felt pleased but didn't think much more about it. She had several cars to work on, and the day was already promising to be busy. Around noon, her cell phone rang with an unknown number. "Is this Sarah Martinez?" the voice asked. "Yes, this is Sarah. My name is Jennifer Walsh and I'm calling from Reynolds Construction. We have a position available that might interest your husband Miguel. Could you have him call me this afternoon?" Sarah was confused. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong number. My husband hasn't applied to your company." "Actually, we got his information through a referral," Jennifer explained. "Our CEO specifically requested that we reach out to him. The position is for a construction supervisor on a major downtown project. The starting salary would be $68,000 a year, plus full benefits." Sarah nearly dropped the phone. $68,000 was more than she and Miguel made combined in their current situations. "Are you sure you have the right person?" "Miguel Martinez, construction worker." "That's correct. Mr. Reynolds was very specific about wanting to speak with him. Could you have Miguel call me at this number today?" After hanging up, Sarah sat in her car during her lunch break, trying to process what had just happened. The timing seemed too coincidental to be random. She thought about David Reynolds from the night before, and suddenly the pieces started falling into place. When she got home that evening, Miguel was waiting with incredible news. Not only had he gotten the job, but he had also met with David Reynolds personally. David had explained that he wanted experienced, reliable workers for his team, and that Miguel came highly recommended. "But Miguel," Sarah said carefully, "did Mr. Reynolds mention how he knew about you?" Miguel shook his head. "He just said he had heard good things about my work ethic and reliability. Why do you ask?" Sarah decided not to say anything yet. She wanted to be certain of her suspicions before jumping to conclusions. But deep down, she was beginning to understand that the man whose car she had fixed was trying to help her family in return. 2 weeks later, David brought his Mustang back to the shop for the permanent repairs Sarah had recommended. When he arrived, Sarah was waiting for him with a knowing smile. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, "I think we need to talk." David tried to look innocent, but his expression gave him away immediately. "What about?" "About the fact that you're the CEO of Reynolds Construction, and about the amazing job opportunity that mysteriously appeared for my husband right after I worked on your car." David's shoulders relaxed, and he smiled sheepishly. "You figured it out." "It wasn't that hard," Sarah laughed. "Miguel came home talking about this wonderful Mr. Reynolds who seemed to know all about his situation and his family. Plus, what are the odds that a major construction company would randomly call looking for him?" "I hope you're not offended," David said seriously. "I just felt like I needed to do something after what you did for me that night. You saved my entire business, Sarah. That meeting I made because of your work. We landed a $50 million contract. Your husband having a good job seemed like the very least I could do to say thank you." Sarah looked at this man who had just changed her family's entire future, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Mr. Reynolds, you didn't owe us anything. I was just doing my job." "No," David said firmly. "You went far beyond just doing your job. You took a risk to help a stranger, and you did it with skill and integrity that I rarely see anymore. Miguel is going to be a valuable addition to my team, but this all started because you showed me what real character looks like." Over the following weeks, David became a regular customer at Frank's garage, bringing not only his Mustang but also recommending the shop to his business associates. Sarah found herself working on luxury cars and vintage vehicles that she had only dreamed of servicing before. Word spread quickly through David's network about the talented mechanic who had performed miracles on his classic car. The increased business meant more income for the shop, and Mr. Frank was so pleased that he gave Sarah a significant raise and promoted her to lead mechanic. For the first time in years, Sarah felt financially secure and professionally respected. Meanwhile, Miguel was thriving in his new position at Reynolds Construction. David had been right about Miguel's work ethic and reliability. Within just a month, Miguel had impressed everyone on the job site with his attention to detail and leadership skills. David began giving him more responsibilities and including him in planning meetings for upcoming projects. One evening, as David was picking up his Mustang after a routine maintenance appointment, he and Sarah were talking about how well Miguel was doing when David noticed something that made him pause. As Sarah handed him his keys, the light caught her wedding ring in a way that made him look more closely. The ring was simple and clearly old, but there was something distinctive about the setting that seemed familiar. David found himself staring at it longer than was polite, trying to remember where he had seen that particular style before. "That's a beautiful ring," he said carefully. "It looks like it might be vintage." Sarah glanced down at her hand and smiled warmly. "It was my grandmother's ring. She gave it to my mother, and my mother gave it to me when Miguel and I got engaged. It's not worth much money, but it means everything to me." David felt his heart skip a beat. "Your grandmother, what was her name?" "Elena Vasquez," Sarah replied, looking puzzled by the question. "She worked as a seamstress for many years." "Why do you ask?" The blood drained from David's face as memories came flooding back. Elena Vasquez. He remembered that name and he remembered that ring. Suddenly, he was 8 years old again, standing in his family's kitchen, watching his mother cry as she carefully wrapped a small ring in tissue paper. "Sarah," David said quietly, his voice shaking slightly, "I need to tell you something, and it's going to sound impossible, but I think your grandmother's ring once belonged to my family." Sarah stared at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" David took a deep breath. "When I was a child, my family went through some very hard times. My father's business failed, and we lost almost everything. My mother had a ring that had been passed down through generations of my family. It was distinctive because of its unusual setting. 3 small diamonds arranged in a specific pattern around a central stone." Sarah looked down at her ring with new eyes. It did indeed have 3 small diamonds arranged exactly as David had described. "My mother had to sell that ring to help pay for food and rent," David continued. "She sold it to a pawn shop, but she always regretted it. She used to tell me that someday when things got better, she would try to find it again. She never did manage to track it down before she passed away." Sarah was speechless. She looked at the ring that had been on her finger every day for the past 10 years, the ring that connected her to her grandmother and her family's history. "Are you saying you think this is the same ring?" she asked softly. "I think it might be," David nodded. "My grandmother always told me that ring was special, that it brought good luck to the women who wore it. She said it would always find its way to someone who deserved its protection." The two of them stood in silence for several moments, both processing the incredible coincidence. If David was right, then Sarah's ring had somehow traveled from his family's pawn shop sale, through various owners to her grandmother, then to her mother, and finally to her. "This is unbelievable," Sarah whispered. "Of all the people whose car could have broken down at our shop, of all the mechanics who could have worked on it, it was me. And I was wearing your family's ring the entire time." David shook his head in amazement. "My mother always believed that ring would bring good fortune to whoever was meant to have it. Maybe this is exactly how it was supposed to happen. Maybe you were meant to have that ring, and maybe I was meant to meet you." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she looked at the ring with new understanding. "Your mother sounds like she was a wonderful woman." "She was," David said softly. "And I think she would be happy to know that her ring found its way to someone like you, someone who understands the value of hard work, family, and helping others." As they stood there together, both Sarah and David realized that their meeting had been about much more than a broken-down car or a successful business deal. It was about connections that spanned generations, about kindness being rewarded in unexpected ways, and about the mysterious forces that sometimes bring the right people together at exactly the right moment. The revelation about the ring created a bond between Sarah and David that went far beyond their business relationship. David began sharing stories about his family's struggles during his childhood, how his parents had worked multiple jobs to rebuild their lives after losing everything. Sarah told him about her grandmother Elena, who had immigrated to America with nothing but determination and the hope of building a better life for her family. As the months passed, their friendship deepened. David became like an honorary uncle to Emma, who was fascinated by his stories about building skyscrapers and bridges. Miguel and David discovered they shared a passion for baseball and began attending games together with their families. But the most significant change came in how David approached his business. Inspired by Sarah's example of helping others without expecting anything in return, he began implementing programs at Reynolds Construction to help employees facing financial hardships. He created an emergency fund for workers who needed temporary assistance, and he started actively seeking to hire people who were struggling to find opportunities. Sarah, meanwhile, had been thinking deeply about the ring's history and what it meant to her. After several weeks of consideration, she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. One evening, she asked David to meet her at the shop after hours. When he arrived, he found Sarah sitting in the waiting area, looking thoughtful and determined. "David, I've been thinking about this ring ever since you told me about your family's connection to it," she began. "And I've realized something important." David sat down across from her, curious about what she had decided. "This ring doesn't really belong to me," Sarah continued. "I mean, legally it's mine, and my grandmother gave it to me with love. But knowing its history, knowing that your mother had to sell something so precious during hard times, it doesn't feel right for me to keep it." She began sliding the ring off her finger, but David immediately reached out to stop her. "Sarah, no," he said firmly. "That ring is yours. My mother would never have wanted you to give it up. She sold it because she had to, but she always hoped it would bring happiness to whoever ended up with it." "But it belongs with your family," Sarah protested. David shook his head and smiled. "Don't you see? It did find its way back to my family. You and Miguel and Emma, you're family to me now. This whole experience has taught me that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who show up for each other, who help each other through difficult times, who care about each other's happiness and success." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she understood what David was saying. "Besides," David continued with a grin, "my mother always said that ring brought good luck to the women who wore it. Look at everything that's happened since you've been wearing it. Miguel has his dream job. You've been promoted to lead mechanic. Emma is thriving in school. And you've helped me understand what really matters in life." Over the following year, the friendship between the two families continued to grow stronger. David offered Sarah a position as head of vehicle maintenance for Reynolds Construction, overseeing all of the company's trucks, equipment, and vehicles. The salary was double what she had been making at the garage, and it came with full benefits and opportunities for advancement. Sarah initially hesitated to leave Mr. Frank, but when David offered to contract the garage for additional maintenance work, ensuring that Frank's business would actually grow rather than suffer from her departure, she accepted the position. Miguel was promoted to project manager, overseeing multiple construction sites and earning the respect of everyone he worked with. Emma excelled in her new school and often spent afternoons at the Reynolds Construction office, doing her homework while watching her parents work. On the first anniversary of their meeting, David surprised Sarah by bringing the fully restored Mustang to her new office. The car looked absolutely perfect, with every detail meticulously maintained. "You know," David said as they admired the gleaming vehicle, "this car brought us together, but it's not really about the car at all." Sarah nodded, understanding completely. "It's about being willing to help someone when they need it, even when you don't know if anything good will come from it." "Exactly," David agreed. "And it's about recognizing that sometimes the most important things in life come disguised as ordinary moments. A broken down car, a stranger asking for help, a simple act of kindness." As they stood together, Sarah unconsciously touched the ring on her finger. It had become such a natural part of her that she rarely thought about it anymore. But today she was reminded of its journey and its meaning. "Your mother was right about this ring bringing good luck," she told David. "I think the luck comes from the person wearing it," David replied. "The ring doesn't create good fortune. It finds its way to people who deserve it. People like you, Sarah, who make their own luck by working hard and treating others with kindness and respect." The story of Sarah and David became legendary within their community. It was a reminder that extraordinary things could happen through ordinary acts of kindness, and that sometimes helping a stranger could change not just their life, but your own life in ways you never imagined possible. The ring continued to rest on Sarah's finger, a symbol of the unexpected connections that bind us together and the profound impact we can have on each other's lives when we choose to care.